Pirates of old searched for hidden treasure buried deep underground. But despite their grandiose dreams, for the most part, they didn't find any. Or did they? Hello, I'm Bob McDonald. And you know what? Our scurrilous band of cutthroats here may have actually uncovered some hidden treasure after all. Oh, not gold, groundwater. What? Never thought of groundwater as treasure before? Well, maybe you've been looking at it the wrong way. After all, groundwater is a vital part of our everyday life. It helps us grow the food we eat. It plays an important ecological role. Groundwater recharges our lakes, rivers, streams, and wetlands. In turn, this sustains the many species of plants, fish, and animals that add beauty to our province and tourism dollars to our economy. Groundwater is also vital to many industries in Ontario, especially the food and beverage industries. And it entertains us when we want to have fun. Other than the air we breathe, you're not going to find a more valuable treasure than groundwater. And it's only going to increase in value as people continue to realize the many human and environmental benefits it provides. Today, about 1 in 3 people in Ontario use groundwater for drinking. In rural Ontario, that number jumps to almost 90%. And the good news is, we can find usable groundwater almost anywhere. More than 1.5 million people in Ontario are served by municipal water supplies that draw from groundwater sources. Another 1.3 million people are sustained by private wells, more than 500,000 of them across the province. And this number is growing by about 20,000 new wells a year. Such an important resource and so little understanding of it. Because groundwater is out of sight, it's basically out of mind. I mean, we can see our lakes and rivers, so they get a lot of attention. But we don't see groundwater, so we sort of take it for granted. And that's what this video is all about. In the next few minutes, I'd like to help you understand what groundwater is, where it comes from, why it's important, and why it should be protected. So, let's start by shedding some light on this hidden treasure of ours and dispelling some groundwater myths that have been around for much too long. For example, when I say groundwater, how many of you think of a huge underground lake? And how many of you think of groundwater as a big underground river? Well, you're both wrong. By definition, groundwater is the water that fills cracks in underground rock formations and fills the space between grains of sediment below the land's surface. Question is, how did it get there, and what's it do once it's in the ground? Well, groundwater is part of a larger ecological system called the hydrologic cycle. And as the name implies, it's a continuous circle, so there's no real beginning or end to it. So if we were to start anywhere, why don't we start with the part that everyone's familiar with? Rain. When rain falls to the earth, it follows 3 basic paths, depending on the terrain, geology, and climate of the area. Some of it returns to the atmosphere through evaporation and through transpiration of plants. Some runs off the land into lakes, streams, and rivers. The rest makes its way into the ground. This water keeps moving downward until it reaches a point where the underground sediment is completely saturated. Here, it mixes with groundwater already there. The top of this saturated zone is what's called the water table. Now there's a term you're probably familiar with, water table. Well, here's another one that you may have heard but not understood, aquifer. There are hundreds of aquifers all over Ontario. Some of these are very close to the surface. Others are found hundreds of meters below the surface. An aquifer is a large deposit of permeable sediment or rock formation that contains abundant quantities of usable water. Some aquifers contain just enough groundwater to supply a single home or maybe a farm, but others are so large they can serve dozens of communities. Each aquifer is an extremely valuable resource. That's why, to many communities, geological maps that show exactly where these aquifers exist are the modern-day equivalent of a treasure map. But the hydrologic cycle doesn't stop here. Groundwater doesn't just sit underground. Like surface water, it flows, depending on the contours of the land. But it doesn't flow anywhere near as fast as, say, a river. That's because it's moving through rock fractures and pores. These are cracks and small openings in the underground sediment. In some cases, groundwater only moves a few millimeters a day. In others, it can move tens of meters, But the fact that it does flow is very important. If it wasn't for groundwater, many of the rivers and streams in our province would actually dry up, and so would our wetlands. Groundwater recharged to rivers, streams, and wetlands is all part of the hydrologic cycle. If groundwater didn't somehow make it back to the surface, the whole cycle would stop. So that's the hydrologic cycle. That tells you a bit about how groundwater got to be groundwater in the first place. Now, why is all this so important that I'm standing here in a marsh, we're making a video, and you should be sitting there watching it? That's a very good question. Well, there are a number of good reasons. It's important that we look after this precious resource for the health and well-being of our future generations. Taking care of groundwater also makes good economic sense. For one thing, groundwater is a cheap source of municipal water. In fact, studies in Ontario have shown that the capital cost of developing a groundwater supply can be at least 50% cheaper than the cost of developing surface water supplies. And operating costs are a lot cheaper too. Consider the millions of dollars some communities spend to treat surface water before they can use it. Groundwater, on the other hand, is more protected than surface water and often requires less treatment. Groundwater is also the preferred source of water for much of the food and beverage industry in Ontario. Plus, it's an inexpensive water source for irrigation. It helps improve crop yields and increases farm efficiency. Plus, it supports the recreation and tourism industry by keeping our streams and wetlands healthy. These are just some of the reasons why it's important to protect your groundwater. But then all this begs the question, what are we protecting it from? Basically, communities need to protect their groundwater supply from the two Ds, depletion and degradation. Depletion is pretty straightforward. It means not over-pumping wells to the point where they run dry. Although nature usually recharges a dry well, consistently using more water that can be replaced by rainfall year after year can threaten the long-term viability of groundwater sources. This can cause water tables to fall dramatically and local streams to dry up. And because groundwater flows, it doesn't recognize municipal or county boundaries. So what happens in one community can very often affect the quality or quantity of groundwater available to nearby communities. Speaking of quality, that's the other thing you need to protect. You remember that hydrologic cycle? Rainwater seeps through the earth and becomes groundwater. Well, along the way, it might pick up contaminants that were either on or in the ground. Let me show you what I mean. Here's a sieve that has just rocks and sand in it, like the earth. And if I pour some clean water through this, well, it pretty well comes out not too bad. Still pretty clean. But here's another sieve that has all kinds of garbage in it. And if I pour the water through here, Wow. Oh, that's disgusting. Oh, would you like a drink? Things like poorly managed landfill sites, overuse of road salt, badly maintained underground storage tanks, and excessive use of nutrients or chemicals can pose a risk to groundwater. And once contaminated, groundwater can be difficult and expensive to clean up. That's all the more reason to manage the resource wisely. No matter how small your community, there is something you can do. Just a modest investment in groundwater strategy today can turn into a huge saving for your community in the future. By better understanding this hidden treasure at your disposal, and by involving private citizens, community groups, and businesses, you can put together a groundwater strategy that's tailored to the needs and priorities of your community. There are lots of organizations that can help you get started. You're lucky. Ontario has world-class experts in groundwater. Everyone from assessment to management to protection to cleanup. We'll give you a list of those organizations in just a minute. The important part is to be proactive for the sake of your community, for the communities around you, for your children's sake. Just get started. Begin the process of a groundwater strategy. In part 2 of this video, we'll show you what some other communities around the province are doing to protect their hidden treasure, so stay tuned. But first, here's that list of organizations. Every community has its own reason for developing an effective groundwater strategy. In the case of the Waterloo region, it's because groundwater is vital to their social and economic well-being. They have the single largest concentration of people using groundwater in the province. There are over 100 municipal wells serving 3 urban municipalities and 17 rural communities in the region of Waterloo. Coordinating a groundwater strategy that affected so many people and involved so many stakeholders was going to be quite a challenge. But the commitment of key decision makers in the region ensured action would be taken. And this prompted cooperation from everyone involved.
Getting the community interested in the issue and involved in the solutions was a real challenge. We sat down and tried to say, who's interested, who do we need to work with to protect our groundwater? And we've come up with a number of groups that we're working closely with. The business community is an important stakeholder group. The agricultural community is another one. We've got environmental groups involved. We've got our local university involved. University of Waterloo is sort of a known expertise in groundwater issues.
Their next step was to examine the state of their groundwater resources. They started by using available information on public wells and existing groundwater sources. And then over time, the region began to use computer modeling to map the groundwater sources that contributed to their municipal wells. These computer models made it easy for everyone involved to see exactly what they were dealing with. They show areas most vulnerable to potential impact from different land uses. The Waterloo region began developing a number of tools that would help protect this hidden treasure for generations to come. For example, they adopted some programs to encourage private landowners to protect their groundwater resources, and they adopted some policies on land use on or near important groundwater areas.
The Rural Water Quality Program has been an initiative that's taken by government where they've looked at working cooperatively with farmers. And I think the important thing was with the program, they came and asked farmers, what would you like? What would be a program that you would participate? What would be the features that you would like?
And it's essentially a program to provide funding assistance to farmers to do things to improve water quality, to protect or improve water quality. And these are things like, in our groundwater focus areas, things like proper abandonment of wells, little local wellhead protection kinds of projects, nutrient management planning and proper manure management so that farmers are applying manure on the land in an appropriate way so that it doesn't damage groundwater quality.
It isn't a top-down program. It's something that comes from the grassroots that farmers help develop, farmers help deliver, and then that's where we're looking for acceptance from farmers. And so we see it as a win-win scenario.
Okay, I know what you're thinking. That's all well and good for the Waterloo region, but our community is nowhere near as large as they are. Well, don't worry. Small communities can develop effective groundwater strategies as well. Just ask the village of Dorchester. The entire township has a population of about 8,000 people. The area is mostly agricultural, with some small businesses supplying the local population and the City of London. But in the mid-1980s, development pressures meant the town's water needs were changing. New plans were needed to satisfy the demands of the area's existing and future residents.
The first step was to assess our system, our water system, and our consultants did a study on that. Came up with the conclusion that the first priority was storage, and so the plan was developed for this water tower that's here. The second priority was extra supply, and so that was step 2, was to begin an investigation for the best location for more wells.
With the ministry's help, Dorchester mapped out those areas that directly influenced the water supply to their wells. These were designated as protected areas in the official plan of the township. That means the community of Dorchester decided to restrict land use in these areas to non-livestock agriculture and forestry uses only. That was back in 1989. Has it paid off?
The results of this process have given us a safe and secure supply of water for the population that we have now. And we do have in store some reserves for future development.
So, we've seen how a large, heavily populated community like Waterloo region handled the protection and management of its groundwater. And we've seen how a smaller community like Dorchester achieved many of the same goals with just a modest investment. Well, the next community that we're going to visit has a different set of goals and needs. The city of Barrie wasn't concerned as much about maintaining clean groundwater as it was about demands on its water supplies. Because of rapid growth, their existing wells couldn't sustain the city's ever-increasing thirst for water. Something had to be done.
Right now, Barrie's got about 100,000 people living here. We're projecting a population of about 175,000 by the year 2022. But Barrie has consistently beat those projections over the last few years. We are looking at a freshwater, surface water treatment plant. We have planned for that. We have purchased the land and are going through a process, but it's very expensive, especially compared to groundwater.
It was obvious that Barrie was going to have to cut down on its water use or face millions of dollars in capital costs. But conservation requires commitment from both people and the business community. So with the help of officials from the province, the city worked with a number of different organizations and put a groundwater partnership in place.
The conservation program we did in the city of Barrie was one of replacement of fixtures. Essentially, toilets, shower heads, and aerators were replaced in people's homes with low-flow models of those. The people were able to get the fixtures for no cost other than an installation fee. And we did that over a period of 4 years and replaced about 11,500 homes worth of fixtures. I think we did over 15,000 toilets and about the same number of shower heads, and about 12,000 aerators were replaced in the city of Barrie.
The results were phenomenal. Over 60% of the households in Barrie participated. Not only did they meet their projected goal for water conservation, they exceeded it by 20%. That meant proposed capital costs could be deferred, a real saving for both the municipal government and the taxpayer. So far, we've seen what individual communities can do. In our last example, I'd like to show you what happens when communities band together to manage their groundwater resources. The United Counties of Prescott and Russell in eastern Ontario know the importance of groundwater. Both the agricultural community and the rural, non-farm residents spread across these counties benefit from this hidden treasure. The high cost of replacing this source of fresh water with long-distance pipelines reinforce their need to maintain clean groundwater sources.
Prescott-Russell, c'est un secteur qui est en pleine croissance démographique. Et puis, la population dépend principalement de la nappe phréatique pour leur eau potable. On a vécu dans les dernières années, à cause de la croissance, plusieurs problèmes avec la quantité et la qualité de cette eau potable-là. Et on a donc cru bon de partir ou de développer une stratégie pour l'utilisation de cette eau potable-là. La première chose qu'on a faite, effectivement, c'était de développer des termes de référence pour nous aider à embaucher des firmes d'experts conseils qui nous aideraient finalement à trouver une bonne qualité, une quantité d'eau, et aussi pour nous indiquer les secteurs où on devrait vraiment essayer de protéger la nappe phréatique, puisque c'est notre source principale de l'eau potable pour la plus grande majorité de la population.
Their first step in developing an effective groundwater strategy was to assess their groundwater resources. That's when they discovered an interesting truth about this hidden treasure. Groundwater doesn't recognize political boundaries.
Dans Prescott-Russell, on réalise que notre nappe phréatique, on la partage avec nos voisins du sud, les comtés unis de Stormont, Dundas et Glengarry. Donc, on a réalisé dès le début que c'était important de travailler ensemble. Donc, on va travailler en partenariat avec eux, avec d'autres organismes. Et puis, dans le fin de l'analyse, ce qu'on veut, c'est un projet qui va aller plus loin. On réalise qu'on a un certain montant d'argent pour travailler dans le projet. En travaillant ensemble, on va finir avec de l'information qui est de plus haute qualité. On va avoir plus d'informations et puis, finalement, on va avoir un projet qui va nous donner plus en termes de capacité de planifier notre stratégie pour la protection de la nappe phréatique dans Prescott et Russell.
4 different communities, 4 different circumstances and approaches. So, what does that tell us? No community is an island. That's because groundwater doesn't recognize municipal or regional boundaries. It also tells us that understanding groundwater conditions is an essential part of a groundwater strategy. Look at the land uses and water demands being placed on groundwater that could influence its health. Set your goals and targets for maintaining important groundwater functions. And we've also seen that there are a lot of tools available that communities can use, such as private land stewardship, groundwater conservation, and land use controls. Finally, these examples tell us that all members of the community need to work together to develop and apply these tools. All it takes is one person or one group to get the ball rolling. Once everyone realizes the value of what's buried beneath their feet, cooperation and commitment quickly follow. There are a number of both public and private organizations in the province that can help you get started with information, technical support, advice. You'll be seeing a list of those organizations in just a minute. I suggest you contact the one nearest you right away and start your groundwater strategy, because the sooner you get started, the sooner you'll reap the benefits of this hidden treasure we call groundwater.